don't remain faithful to me. Great is your faithfulness. You did exactly what you said. You said that if we are faithful to you, there will be blessing. If we depart from your ways, worship other gods, chase after political rulers instead of the one true God, if we do that, there will be severe judgment and it will not be fun. You were right. Great is your faithfulness. About 50 years later, Persia takes over the Babylonian Empire, and we read about that in Daniel 5:30 and in Daniel 6 as well. That's in 538, the year 538. After that, there is a first return, and we'll talk about the foreign policy of the Persians as opposed to the Babylonians. I don't think the Babylonians had a foreign policy other than capture and kill. That was pretty much it. It was pretty straightforward. For reasons we'll describe later on, King Cyrus especially, the Persian leader at that time, had a different foreign policy, but God uses that to bring his people back to the land, secretly pulling the strings even of the greatest rulers and kings that have ever lived. And that's the beauty that we see in the book of Ezra. The Jews are sent back to their land based on this decree of Cyrus. About 42,000 Jews returned to the land, returned to Jerusalem under the leadership of Zerubbabel. You might want to put out to the side, you might want to put Ezra, chapters 1 through, I think that takes us up through chapter 6. Chapter 1 through 6 is about this first group of returnees to the land in 538. Some of the struggles, some of the victories that they have initially, but some of the struggles they face as they go. The altar for sacrifice is rebuilt, the foundation of the temple is laid, everything's going well, work on the temple is begun and then stopped because of opposition. Which isn't that kind of silly? It seems like it, but you know what? We back down from doing what we think God wants us to do when we face little pockets of resistance as well. We do the same thing. 520, Haggai begins his ministry. Work on the temple is resumed, so he encourages the exile or the returnees to continue work on the temple. The temple is completed in 516 and dedicated. In 458, we see the second return under Ezra. About 1,500 Jews return under the leadership of Ezra. Out to the side, you can put Ezra chapters 7 through 10. We'll get into that section. And it's a whole different situation when Ezra comes. And we'll talk about that because that's fascinating. There's the third return in 444 under Nehemiah, and in 430 Malachi, the last Old Testament prophet, the last Old Testament writer. Around that time, he's prophesying to the Jewish nation. Now, you wonder, well, where does this 70-year period come in? Because you remember Jeremiah prophesied about a 70-year period. Where does this 70-year period work? And I just want to address that. Because I know some of you are probably wondering, where does that fit in here? Well, there's three different ways to reckon the 70-year period idea. The first way is you can think of 70 years in terms of people, okay? I hope you can see that. Can you see that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so you have from 605, the first deportation, to about 538. I'm not afraid of that being a little shorter than 70 years. I think 70 years in this is a little bit of a rough estimate, and I think some of the chronology is debatable. But we have about a 70-year period between the first deportation and the first return. Okay, that might be Jeremiah's 70 years. And Daniel picks up on this. Several people in the Old Testament pick up on this idea of the 70 years. That 70 years, however, might also be related to the temple. 586, the temple is destroyed. 516, exactly 70 years later, it is rebuilt. That could be the 70 years. Another theory, however, is that even though God said it would be 70 years, as God typically does, he may have shortened the length of that time and just used it as about the 50-year period from when the temple was destroyed in 586 to when the first returnees come back in 538. In fact, there's a fascinating verse in Matthew, we won't turn there, but just you might want to jot this down, Matthew 24, verse 22, where Jesus is talking about the apocalypse, the end of times, and he says, if those days were not shortened for the sake of the elect, there'd be nothing left, basically. So I'm suggesting, and others have suggested, that maybe God shortened this time period from the original 70 years, for the sake of his mercy, and we see evidence of God's mercy all over the place. Which is the right one? I don't really know. I don't think it's really that, to me it's not that important, but here are the different ideas about what people think in terms of what those 7 years might have been. Let me mention a couple notes about Cyrus. In fact, if you're still on that back sheet, you'll notice the first emperor there of the Persian Empire, and he's the first person we come into contact with in the book of Ezra. So I want to make sure we understand who this Cyrus guy is and what he's doing. You'll notice that on the dates I put, we say that Cyrus's reign begins in 550. Well, that's when Cyrus began to reign over the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire did not subsume the Babylonian Empire until, as we say earlier, in 538, so until about 12 years later. So when Ezra says in the first year of King Cyrus, he's not talking about 550, he's talking about 538. That is the first year that King Cyrus had subsumed Babylon, and from Ezra's perspective, that was the first year of Cyrus's reign. So if you see some historical discrepancies there, that's probably what that will account for some of that confusion. I have a little footnote on that at the bottom. Also, you think, wait a minute. If I recall, at the end of Daniel 5 and into Daniel 6, who's in charge? It's not Cyrus, but who? Who's the Persian king that comes in? Darius. That's right. Who's this Darius guy? Where does he come from? Well, there's a couple of views on that also, and in fact I mentioned this in the first footnote underneath. Darius may have been the same person as Cyrus. We have a lot of examples of people with dual names, and that makes the whole thing a little more confusing. So he might have been the same person as what Daniel calls Darius may have been what Ezra calls Cyrus. Same individual, Darius the Mede. He may have been Cyrus's governor who came to reign and rule over Babylon and sort of kind of set himself up as empire. Then we have this note in Daniel 6:28, which says either the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus, or the reign of Darius, that is, the reign of Cyrus. So there's some interpretive things here. I just don't want you to be thrown off and say, wait a minute, I thought that was King Darius that came and did this. What is interesting, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, it is interesting how Cyrus, who even as he grows in power, does not realize that he becomes a tool of God, fulfilling prophecies that God had made through Isaiah 200 years previously. We'll talk about that in a few minutes, but let's also talk about the foreign policy of the Persians. The foreign policy of the Persians was much more gentle than the Assyrians and the Babylonians. I mean, seriously, the Assyrians and the Babylonians, they want to come in and destroy you. They want to take you out of your land. They want to destroy not only you and your people, they want to make you slaves, but they also want to destroy your culture and your religious faith, because they want you to serve them and become Babylonians, good Assyrians and good Babylonians. Persian foreign policy is a little different, and God is going to use this. Persian foreign policy wanted to send the captive peoples back to repatriate their lands so that they will become good. I think the selfish motive is twofold. First of all, they will become good citizens, they will gain some money, so they will stabilize their own economy and send more tribute into, Persian headquarters, basically. He also wants to send these people back to repatriate their land, to rebuild their religious system, because he wants them to pray to their gods on his behalf, on Cyrus's behalf. Okay, that's how they're thinking. Now, I don't want to get into politics too much, but you think, oh, that's a crazy idea. Well, we spend a lot of money in the United States. We send a lot of money to foreign countries to help them rebuild their culture. And why do we do that? Oh, because we're such nice people. No, because we want their allegiance. We want to make alliances with them. I think the same thing is going on here. Cyrus is trying to extend there's all kinds of rebellions and things going on here. Cyrus is trying to extend his rule by seeming benevolent so that these people would be more faithful servants to him. I really like biblical archaeology. I want to show you this. This is something called the Cyrus cylinder. This is a cylinder that was found by a British archaeologist in 1879. It is a cylinder with Akkadian cuneiform all around it, basically detailing Cyrus's foreign policy, benevolent foreign policy. And it talks about we want to send people, not just the Jews. He did this to everybody. We want to send people back to their homes to rebuild their society so that they would be more faithful to the Persians. God uses this to basically have the Persians fund this expedition, sending the Jews back into their land to rebuild the temple, to rebuild their society. God uses that. God is always protecting his people, always watching out for them, and God doesn't mind using foreign, pagan, godless people to accomplish that, which is very interesting. So we need to be careful when we want to put God in a box and tell God what he can and can't do. I think that's interesting. Before we get into the text, I want to make one more point. And I know we've just kind of been dabbling around with history, but we'll get into some more relevant material here in just a minute as we get into the text. But I want to make a little brief case for the value of historical narrative in the Bible. We spend a lot of time in Paul. I love Paul, and Paul is great, but you know what? Ezra is just as inspired as Paul, who is just as inspired as John. All these people are inspired by God. And like we know from 2 Timothy 3:16, it is all profitable for doctrine, reproof, correction, instruction, and righteousness. Old Testament historical narrative is a way of teaching biblical truth in a different way than what we see in 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. It is showing us the things that people went through and how we can either emulate their example or how we can choose intentionally not to follow their example. In the case of Ezra, I think there's a lot of great examples for us to follow in the different new beginnings that we might have in our own life. And I want you to remember, too, that well, here, let me give you this kind of interesting factoid. Some people have said, and I don't know if you sit down and figures this out, but some people say that between 70 and 80% of the Bible is historical narrative. 70 to 80%. You got your Gospels, you got Acts, you got all the history books of the Old Testament. About 70 to 80% of the Bible is historical narrative, a story. That's a lot. And I know there's some long prophetic books, there are some long epistles, but that's a lot of the Bible. We dare not neglect 70 to 80% of the Bible. We've got to get to know these stories and understand what God wants us to know because of these stories. The authors of historical books are not interested first and foremost in history. They're interested first and foremost in what? Truth. In truth, in theology. They're going to use history to communicate a theological point. But their first, and I believe their history is accurate. But their main concern is they want to communicate something to you and I, even today, about God's interaction with his people. About the struggles that God's peoples can go through, about the victories that God's peoples can enjoy. That's the main point of historical narrative. If it were just about history, Ezra would be very bad history. Because Ezra ends up skipping 60 years of history between when the temple was built and when Ezra returns. It would be terrible history. He's not concerned about history. He's concerned about God's story, about theology, and how God interacts with his people. So even Ezra's, and it's reliable history, we can trust it, but remember that there's a greater point than just the historical minutia. We're not always satisfied. We sometimes want to say, oh, I wish I knew more. I wish he would have said more about this historical issue. But his point is not to satisfy our historical curiosities. His point is to tell us about God. That's the point. Phil Vischer had a fantastic opportunity for new beginnings, and what we're going to see in Ezra is two new beginnings. We're going to see a new beginning under Zerubbabel in chapter